Hello Internet, and welcome to the Collective Arcana. We're a channel all about tabletop gaming, and today we're going to take a quick detour away from our ongoing Pathfinder Second Edition class videos to talk about familiars in Pathfinder Second Edition. The reason we're doing this video is because we just did the Witch a little bit out of order, and I wanted to do the familiars first because somebody really wanted the Witch, and unfortunately, the holidays and everything, we didn't have time to get them both out at the same time, so here's familiars. It's good because we're getting ready to do Sorcerer and Wizard coming up soon as we round out the Pathfinder Second Edition classes, so, definitely going to need familiars for those two potentially, so good time to do it. Hey guys, before we start talking about familiars, which are cute and great, go ahead down there at the bottom, hit that subscribe button, give us a like. We try to make good content for you, and if you're enjoying it, we really would appreciate it. It helps the channel out a whole lot. Thanks so much. So what is a familiar? A familiar is quite simply just a little critter that has some link to you magically and to your magical power. The exact nature of that relationship can vary a lot based on what your core class is. For example, a druid's familiar is not going to be as big a part of their character as a wizard's familiar, and neither are going to be as big of a part as a witch's familiar is to what they do. So it can vary quite a bit, but the gist of it is the same and universal, even though within each of those classes or archetypes or however you might get your familiar, there might be some additional terms. We're just going to talk about the core, what you get if you have a familiar. So familiars are typically tiny animals. There are, of course, alternative options, some even specific familiars like a fairy dragon that are very unique, or an imp that have a lot of extra things going on, which we'll sort of talk about later. But generally speaking, it's going to be some sort of a tiny animal, an owl, a bat, a toad, classic familiar stuff, a cat. That's pretty standard. And all familiars are going to have the minion trait, which means they can only take actions if you spend one of your actions to give them two, and they cannot ever take reactions. Additionally, unlike most minions, the familiar does not technically have a strike action. So, unlike an animal companion that is also a minion, you cannot make strike attacks with your familiar. Doesn't mean they don't have any offensive options, it just means that they'll get specific ones, if any, from either their stat block for a specific familiar, or from their master and familiar abilities, which we will talk about here in just a moment. One more important thing, though, before we get to the crunchy number part of the familiar, which there really isn't a lot, but you can only ever have one familiar. Doesn't matter how many sources you have telling you can have a familiar, you can only have one. Now, those different sources may have specific rules on, how you might stack those two familiars, how it might how one familiar might be bolstered by having options for another familiar, but in any case, it will always specifically tell you if something combines, and if it doesn't tell you that it combines or stacks or anything in Pathfinder Second Edition, then it doesn't. So modifiers and AC, your familiar is, first of all, it's going to always treat anything that relies on level, it's going to use your level. And that's true whether you've had your familiar, from your base class since level 1, or you didn't pick up your familiar till level 12 when you picked up an archetype that gave you one. Either way, familiar is always going to be considered your level, and it's always going to get its HP is going to be equal to 5 times your level, again, regardless of when you got it. And its AC is always going to equal your AC, exactly your AC, whatever that AC is, except for any status or circumstance bonuses that you may have. It may not get those, although a lot of things like statuses are going to be from spells, and if it affects multiple creatures and the familiars in that area, of course it will be affected. But by default, just your AC minus status and circumstance bonuses. All familiars can use or are functionally trained in perception and acrobatics and stealth. So a familiar being trained, for lack of a better term, in a skill is not the same as a regular character being trained. The familiar is always going to add your level plus your ability score modifier that you used for spellcasting. If for some reason you have a familiar and do not cast spells, then it's going to use your charisma modifier. Or if you are getting your familiar from another source, it may specifically tell you, like I believe alchemists will always use intelligence, for example, even though you're not casting spells. It calls out that it gets intelligence as its modifier. But if you don't have a spellcasting ability modifier and nothing is specifically telling you, it defaults to charisma. So it can't use those skill checks or those skills to do anything that would be a strike action, but it can use any other trained actions that it qualifies for trained, specifically for those skill or for perception, acrobatics, and stealth. Any other skill checks that it attempts, it can't use the trained actions. And it does not get to add your ability score modifier, just your level. So even its worst skills might still be better than your skills, which is, maybe kind of fun for you. Big thing to note with familiars, they do not have their own ability score modifiers at all. They do not exist. And they also cannot benefit from an item bonus to any sort of checks or anything like that. All familiars are considered tiny. Again, you may get something that changes that, but by default, they are all considered tiny. They also all have low light vision and can empathically communicate with their master up to 1 mile away. So what does that mean? It means that it can convey emotions. So if your familiar is scared or angry or in pain, you could know that up to 1 mile away, and it could know vice versa. So if it's off doing something and then suddenly you're in pain, it might be able to make that judgment call, depending on how smart your familiar is, which will vary, of course. It might be able to make that judgment call of, I should probably get back and make sure everything's okay. All familiars get to choose a single movement, either a land speed or a swim speed, and they get 25 feet in that movement speed, and that's just standard. Be one of the original members of the Collective Arcana by clicking subscribe. And that's the gist. Not very impressive, is it? A familiar is obviously it can't even make strikes, but it's not going to be a battlefield presence for you. If you're making use of that familiar, it's most likely going to be out of combat, or you're going to be taking advantage of a master and familiar ability. So each day, as part of your preparations, you can choose 2 master and familiar abilities, and we'll go over sort of a quick rundown of those options. We're not going to cover all of them or even go into detail on all of them, but we'll do sort of a list through. And you get to pick 2 of those per day. Now, and you get to change them out every day with your daily preparations, but there is a caveat there. If your familiar would naturally have one of the master and familiar abilities, for example, a fly speed, if you have an owl, it must have a fly speed. So there you go. You have to spend one of those every day for your familiar on flight, because otherwise it's not a very good owl. It just can't fly. Now, with that said, you could always come up with an RP solution with your GM. Maybe you say, my owl, has never been able to fly because of an injury when it was a chick. It's got 1 weak wing, so it's got a land speed, no fly speed, but I still get to have my cute little owl turning 360 degrees around. So that's a lot of fun. It's nice to have the option. It's not explicitly stated in the rules, but that I know of, but it's definitely something that you could do. An extension of that is you cannot have a familiar that naturally has more abilities than you have master and familiar abilities to spend in the morning. So if you were trying to, for example, choose, let's say, what's a good example that would have 3? Let's just say you're trying to choose a creature that would have a fly speed and a special vision type and, whatever. I can't think of any animals off the top of my head. Down in the comments, I'm sure you can think of some, but if it's got to have at least 3 and you only have 2, you can't choose that animal. That's not to say that you could never have that animal. Most classes that get access to familiars and archetypes will give you the option for an improved familiar, where you can choose 2 additional master and familiar abilities at your preparation every day. So that can be how you unlock the access to that specific, unique familiar that you really want. Or again, you could work with your GM and say, hey, I know that normally this creature can see in the dark, but I really want this creature. Don't necessarily see the benefit of having an improved familiar. Can I just have it and it can't do the thing? And your GM is probably going to say yes. In the case of a witch, we covered that, you can get up to 10 master and familiar abilities. So that's a lot. That's almost all of them. Honestly, it's certainly going to be all of them that you're concerned with. And we sort of talked about in the witch video, which will be somewhere around here. It's a really good feature. Some of these master and familiar abilities are very good and can really open up your options with your little magical friend. So let's just sort of run down real quick a few of these. You're going to be able to increase or add movement types. You're going to be able to give them new types of senses, the ability to speak with creatures of their kind, or to speak and understand any sort of language that you have access to. They're going to be able to gain access to additional skills, where they get to add your ability score modifier to them and unlock the trained actions of those skills. So if you want a really scary raven, you could have a scary raven, go full Edgar Allan Poe with it. They're also going to get the ability to be a better assistant, whether that's holding tools and handing them to you mid-combat, or assisting you with your alchemical preparations, all sorts of things like that. As far as the master abilities go, you're going to be able to get some extra cantrips or an extra spell slot up to 3 levels below your highest level. You're going to be able to get extra regents if you're an alchemist or dabble in alchemy. They'll be able to share your senses, so you can see through their eyes, they can see through yours. The ability to help replenish your focus pool, which can be very, very big. They can also deliver touch spells for you, which is huge. It's like having the feat, the metamagic feat of ranged touch, except potentially further, and so that's nice, and it doesn't cost you a feat, so I'd say plus to me. So as you can see, there's a lot of options for familiars, and the abilities they give you as the master as well. Pretty wide range. All of them can certainly be either situationally or pretty much always big bonuses to your character. And it can add a fun little element of having, you're sort of in a second place at once. You have these additional abilities. You have something that you can send ahead to scout, all that. And just the abilities that we have now, there's over 20 of them, I think. And then when Secrets of Magic comes out in July, that's going to be even more. So I imagine we'll get quite a few with that as well. Familiars are pretty magical. So it's going to be a whole lot of options for you, even more than there already are. And I already feel like out of the gate right now, there's a lot of them. So familiars, I think, are better than they've ever been. They're a lot of fun, a great addition to your character, and just huge number of options to customize. So if you have the option, get a familiar. All right, everybody, that's our video on familiars, your fun little magical friends. Hopefully you learned something. If you have any specific questions, don't forget to leave a comment down there to ask us, or just tell us about what kind of weird familiar you have. And that's about it. Thanks so much for watching. Welcome to the Collective, and we'll see you next time. Bye.